September 8th, 2020. The sun rose on a new day, bringing life to the stage that stood above the fearful nation. The stage that would change everything. The future of L'Manberg sat hopelessly in its grasp, the members of the nation distracting their dread through festival games, but it could only do so much. It would only be a few hours until the votes were set, and their lives weren't theirs to be had anymore. Wilbur Soot had been the founder and previous leader of this nation. He gave up his position to prove trust within the members he had been working alongside for what felt like his entire life. But now, he stood in the bright morning sun, wondering why he felt so alone in the nation that he built. His partner, Tommyinnit, had joined him on the podium as Wilbur broke the news to his competitors. The votes were in. Whoever was going to win this election was on the paper held in Wilbur's hand. There was no going back now. Wilbur held the future within his hands. Whether he'd keep his legacy or hand it to the next man was up to the paper. But whether he read the contents of it or spoke a string of lies that secured him the position that he felt so strongly he deserved was up to him. The audience gathered from their games to the wooden chairs in front of the arena and looked up for assurance from their candidates, but saw nothing but a mirror of their stress. It would only be minutes now until their futures were determined, and the competitors seemed just as fearful as the people carefully judging from below. The chatter grew silent as Wilbur walked up to the microphone, waiting anxiously for the fateful words only he knew at this moment. Tommy had been begging for the results previously, but Wilbur preferred to keep the weight on his own, and now the weight would finally be free. Whether this lifted weight would be a blessing or a curse, it was not up to him. It was up to the numbers. With an astounding 20,000 votes, coming in fourth place was Coconut 2020. Despite being only 9% of the vote, they celebrated their win, ignoring the accusations of voter fraud, and Wilbur continued to the next. With 16% of the vote came Schlatt's party, which came as a surprise to him. He had a big reputation within the people, but that reputation may just have been the thing that dragged him down. Then, the final results. As Wilbur began to read the results into the microphone, his mouth began revealing a small smirk, revealing the answer before it could even thought to be said. In second place, with 30%, Swag 2020, leaving Pog 2020 with 46% of the audience's votes. Only a 16% difference, but that was all they needed to secure the nation to themselves. The crowd grew loud with a mix of cheers and boos, but all Wilbur could hear at that moment was a roar of the people who he now knew that he could trust. This was the beginning of a new era for L'Manberg. This was Chapter 2. The opposing teams were sent down to the chairs, now blending in with the very people who betrayed them. They all listened, some hesitantly, some proud, to the first speech of the president of L'Manberg. Wilbur spoke with a taunting smirk on his face, as if to ridicule his old competitors without even batting an eye. His first decree as the emperor of his great country was to imprison Jschlatt for the clear voter fraud in the election. And just like that, Jschlatt was sent off, and Wilbur's speech had ended. He stepped on the podium as a candidate and left as president. Quackity reluctantly accepts the results, but realizes that because he hadn't won, he still isn't a member of L'Manberg, and he could potentially end up with Schlatt in prison. The thought frightens him, so he runs to Wilbur, begging for mercy from his old enemy. Wilbur laughs at the idea, but soon rethinks the request. Quackity seemed desperate to join the nation, but exactly how desperate? Wilbur proposes an idea. If Quackity builds a second layer of the wall, he could be given citizenship to the nation. All Quackity would have to do is build a wall, right? The same wall that he swore to destroy, the wall that was built to keep all of his fellow Americans out, the wall that seemed to separate him from everything he's ever wanted, that wall? Quackity thought hard about this offer, day and night, until finally giving up his dignity to begin the construction of the border. Throughout his decision process, he often visited Schlatt for advice. He wasn't much, but that was all that Quackity had. Jschlatt suggested that Quackity build the wall, but not exactly as intended. Schlatt convinced him to leave faults surrounding the border, leaving L'Manberg vulnerable from every direction. So while he could pretend he was strengthening one of the key parts of the capital, he was really sabotaging everyone that laid inside. Lucky for Quackity, the perfect opportunity arose for these weak spots to come into use. The festival. There was a festival to be held in the days coming to celebrate Wilbur's inauguration, and if everything went according to Quackity's plan, Wilbur's presidency could end only days after it begun. Quackity began the journey around the server, successfully convincing the Dream Team and others to help him take down who he referred to as the Tyrant. And on the day of the festival, Quackity couldn't be happier to see his fellow Americans sneaking in through the cracks that he built. It was foolish of Wilbur to not check the progress of his border, but he was too busy showing gratitude towards his people, and chatting away with his vice president on all the future plans he had for the nation. On the night of the festival, he had been planning to unveil all these plans, after swearing to no more secrecy between them, hoping this would lead to a greater divide in his win during the next election. He steps on stage. Though the bright sun was no longer on his side, he had his vice president, and he could contently say that he was no longer alone. From the tall buildings, the spies stood alone, ready to fire at any given moment. Wilbur begins his attempt at a heartfelt speech, trying to persuade everyone on how appreciative he was to have them, when all he could think about was all the ways he was going to ruin it, all the ways he wanted to ruin it. On Quackity's signal, a single arrow flies down from the sky, then another, and another, until it's raining sharp, flint-pointed arrows, hitting people all the way from the back of the seats to the two standing aghast on the podium. When the people looked for direction from their leader, they could see nothing in his eyes. Wilbur knew who was doing this, but for once in his life, he couldn't just play it off, ignore it. Hell, he couldn't even run away. He was struck by the beauty of the graceful, slick arrows hitting the tough ground, hitting the buildings, hitting his people. He stood in awe, or terror. He couldn't quite figure it out, but in a strange way, he didn't want to figure it out, until he heard a bold demand being yelled by a familiar voice in the distance. "Resign now, or we'll leave nothing of your nation but ashes." It was Quackity. Wilbur stepped toward the end of the podium to see Quackity atop a building, looking down at him with the same anger from the election day. He had hid it so well behind the tears and mercy, but Wilbur knew a rage like that couldn't be dropped. And to be honest, Wilbur was excited to see it. He loved seeing Quackity break. Seeing his nation being destroyed in front of his eyes didn't even faze him. It seemed almost beautiful in a way. The weight was finally lifted. But even under his trance, he saw the people who trusted him, looking at him through the cracks in their hiding spots, begging for it all to be over. And no matter how much he enjoyed this, he needed it to be stopped. Wilbur uttered the words he thought he never would, the words that felt like stabs straight through his heart, the words that stung his throat, the words that seemed to tear him from his seams, though he was so sure that he never cared at all. "I resign." His words felt like nothing compared to the screams of the area in front of him. But when the arrows came to a halt, the screams paused, and the broken glass sat still on the blood-covered battlefield, he knew it was over. We just hit 1,700 subscribers, which is insane, so thank you so much, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider pressing the subscribe button, and thank you so much for watching until the end. I hope I get to see you in the next one.